Welcome back to BiochemSerye Learning on the Go. This is podcast 1C, and we're diving into functional groups in biochemistry. Teaching this can sometimes feel like you're trying to explain the alphabet of life,
Yeah.
like it's super essential, but sometimes a little dry.
Yeah, it's definitely foundational. And let's be honest, sometimes we get bogged down in all the details and forget to step back and show students why these groups are just so fascinating.
Right. It's like they're not just these little clusters of atoms. They're
Yeah.
really the key to understanding how all the how molecules behave and interact, and ultimately how they drive all those amazing biological processes that we teach about. So for our fellow biochem professors out there, let's rediscover the magic of functional groups together.
Absolutely, yeah. It's really about helping our students see the forest for the trees. Instead of, just memorizing structures, let's empower them to think critically about how those structures dictate function.
I'm with you. So let's start with a functional group that I think is pretty familiar to everyone, the hydroxyl group, denoted as OH. It's simple, right? Oxygen bonded to hydrogen, but it's anything BUT boring.
Yeah, it really is deceptively simple. I mean, think about it. The oxygen atom is significantly more electronegative than hydrogen.
Right.
So it pulls those shared electrons closer,
Hmm.
creating a polar bond with a partial negative charge on the oxygen and a partial positive charge on the hydrogen.
Just like in water, which
Mm.
is why this group makes molecules hydrophilic, or what we call water-loving. And since, cells basically like swimming in water, that's kind of a huge deal.
Yeah, exactly. That polarity leads to hydrogen bonding. So think about it. Those partially positive hydrogens on one hydroxyl group, like getting cozy with the partially negative oxygen on another, this is critical for things like protein folding and how those big complex molecules maintain their shapes.
And don't forget about carbohydrates.
Mhm.
All those hydroxyl groups all over glucose, for instance, are why sugar dissolves so easily in water.
Right. It's like a perfect illustration to use in class. You could even have students design an experiment. Like, what happens when you try to dissolve fats, which are mostly nonpolar, in water?
Yeah.
It's a hands-on way to drive home the point about polarity and solubility.
Okay, so hydroxyl groups, hydrophilic, involved in hydrogen bonding, critical for structure and solubility. Check. What's next on our functional group tour?
Okay, let's move on to the carbonyl group, the CSO wonder. So it's a carbon double bonded to oxygen. And that double bond actually creates a dipole moment with the oxygen being partially negative and the carbon partially positive.
Now, this is where things get like a bit more complex because we've got two flavors of carbonyl groups, right? We've got ketones and aldehydes. I always remember this by thinking ketones, they're in the middle.
Oh.
Aldehydes, they're the aldehyde of the molecule.
Yeah, I like that. So ketones have the carbonyl group within the carbon chain, while aldehydes have it at the end. Acetaldehyde, the compound that gives you a hangover, is a prime example of an aldehyde.
Oh, that's a real-world connection students might remember. But why does the location of that carbonyl group matter?
Well, it influences the molecule's reactivity and how it interacts with other molecules. That partial positive charge on that carbonyl carbon makes it a target for nucleophiles, those electron-rich species looking to share some love, if you will.
So the carbonyl group is a bit of a social butterfly, ready to mingle and form bonds.
Hmm.
And these guys show up everywhere, right? In sugars, hormones, even in those aromatic compounds that give flowers their scents.
Yeah, and speaking of reactivity, let's move on to the carboxyl group, written as DOH. And it's basically like a carbonyl group with a bonus hydroxyl group attached.
And this is where we get into acidity. That DCOH screams, I can donate a proton.
Mhm.
It's what makes carboxylic acids, well, acidic.
Exactly, and it's why amino acids are called acids. They have that carboxyl group as part of their structure, and that acidic nature is key to how they link together to form proteins.
Okay, so the carboxyl group is like the Sour Patch Kid of the functional group world, donating protons left and right.
Uh-huh.
So what's next on our list?
Well, if the carboxyl group is the acid, then the amino group is the base. Written as NH2, it's got that nitrogen with a lone pair of electrons just itching to accept a proton.
The classic acid-base duo. And again, we see this in amino acids, right? They've got both a carboxyl group and an amino group.
Exactly, and it's that interaction between those two groups that allows amino acids to link up through those peptide bonds, forming those long polypeptide chains that make up proteins.
And those peptide bonds are formed through condensation reactions, right? where a water molecule is released as the carboxyl group and amino group, get together.
Precisely. It's like a beautiful example of how functional groups drive the formation of these complex biomolecules. And it's a great opportunity to talk about the energetics of these reactions, how the formation of a water molecule helps drive the reaction forward.
Okay, we're starting to see how we can weave these concepts together to tell a more engaging story for our students. And speaking of stories, what about the functional group that gives curly hair its bounce?
Ah, yes. The sulfhydryl group, or DESH-SH. It's a sulfur atom bonded to a hydrogen. Not as flashy as some of the others, but definitely crucial for protein structure.
It's all about those disulfide bridges. Two sulfhydryl groups from different parts of a protein can react, forming a strong covalent bond that links those parts together.
Right, and those disulfide bonds are essential for protein folding and stability. Think about keratin, the protein that makes up your hair and nails. It's loaded with cysteine, the amino acid that contains the sulfhydryl group.
And this is a great example to use in class, I think, because students can really relate to it, right? They can visualize those disulfide bonds holding those protein strands together,
Yeah.
giving hair its shape. Breaking those bonds is what happens when you get a perm or use a chemical hair straightener.
Exactly. It's a great way to bring the chemistry to life, and help them understand that functional groups aren't just these abstract concepts. They're at work in the everyday world.
Okay, so we've covered hydroxyl, we've covered carbonyl, carboxyl, amino, and sulfhydryl. So what's next on our functional group lineup?
Let's talk about the powerhouse of the cell, the phosphate group, denoted as Bi2O4. It's a phosphorus atom bonded to 4 oxygen atoms. And it carries a negative charge, which makes it acidic.
Yes. The phosphate group, every biology student knows this one from ATP, right? Adenosine triphosphate. It's the molecule that fuels cellular processes.
And it's those phosphate groups that are key to ATP's energy storage capability. The bonds between those phosphate groups are high-energy bonds. When those bonds are broken, energy is released, and the cell can then use that energy to do work.
So it's not just the phosphate group itself, but how it's connected to other phosphate groups in ATP that makes it such a good energy carrier.
Exactly. And we see phosphate groups in other important molecules too, like DNA and RNA. So the phosphate groups actually link the sugar molecules in the backbone of these nucleic acids, giving them stability and allowing for genetic information to be stored and transmitted.
So phosphate groups are essential for energy storage, genetic information, and even cell signaling. Talk about multitasking. Are there any other functional groups that we need to cover?
There are two more that are worth mentioning: the methyl and the acetyl groups. They're not as common as the others, but they still play important roles.
Okay, so let's hear about these lesser known functional groups. What makes them special?
Well, the methyl group, or NECA-CH3, is like the simplest of all the functional groups. It's just a carbon atom bonded to 3 hydrogens.
It sounds pretty basic, but I'm guessing it still has some important functions.
You bet. Don't underestimate the power of the methyl group. It's involved in methylation, which is a process where a methyl group is added to a molecule. This, seemingly small change can have a huge impact on a molecule's behavior.
Can you give us an example of methylation in action?
Absolutely. So one classic example is DNA methylation. Adding a methyl group to DNA can change its structure and actually silence certain genes.
Wow. So a tiny methyl group can control gene expression. That's incredible. What about the acetyl group?
So the acetyl group, or DISH-CoZ-CH3, is a bit more complex. It's a methyl group attached to a carbonyl group, and it's involved in acetylation, which is another modification that can alter a molecule's properties. Like methylation, acetylation plays a role in gene expression, but it can also affect protein function and even cellular signaling.
I see. So it's like these smaller functional groups, methyl and acetyl, act as these molecular switches, turning things on or off, suddenly changing a molecule's behavior.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. And it highlights the importance of even the seemingly small players in the world of biochemistry.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, and it seems like functional groups are everywhere, right? From the proteins that make up our cells, to the carbohydrates we eat, to the DNA that carries our genetic information. But so far we've been talking about them mostly as these individual units. How do they work together?
That's a great question, and it's important to remember that functional groups aren't just these isolated entities. They interact, they form bonds, and they drive the amazing diversity of biochemical reactions that we see in living organisms.
So it's like a molecular dance where those functional groups are the dancers swirling and partnering up to create the music of life. Can you can you give us some specific examples? What are some of their favorite moves on the dance floor?
Of course. Let's start with a simple example, like the formation of disaccharides, those double sugars like sucrose and lactose. Remember those hydroxyl groups that we talked about? Well, they're the stars of this show.
Right, the water-loving OH groups.
Exactly. So two monosaccharides, each with a hydroxyl group, can link up through a condensation reaction. So one hydroxyl group loses a hydrogen, the other loses an OH, forming a water molecule as a byproduct.
And what's left behind? A bond between the two sugar molecules.
Precisely. And that bond, formed through the interaction of those two hydroxyl groups, creates a disaccharide. So it's like a classic example of how functional groups drive the assembly of these larger molecules.
Okay, that's a sweet example. What about something a bit more complex, like the formation of those peptide bonds we talked about earlier? How do those amino and carboxyl groups get together?
Ah, the peptide bond formation. It's all about the interplay between the acidic carboxyl group and the basic amino group, the dynamic duo of protein synthesis.
Right, those two are like molecular magnets, just like attracted to each other.
Exactly. So imagine this. You have two amino acids. One has its carboxyl group at one end. The other has its amino group at the other end. They come together, and again, through a condensation reaction, the carboxyl group loses an OH. The amino group loses a hydrogen, and what do we get?
Another water molecule
Ah,
and a peptide bond linking those two amino acids together.
you got it. And repeat that over and over, and you've got a polypeptide chain, the backbone of a protein.
Okay, so it's really all about those functional groups.
Mm-hmm.
From simple sugars to complex proteins, it's these little clusters of atoms interacting, forming bonds that make life happen. I'm feeling inspired.
And that's exactly what we want to pass on to our students.
Absolutely. For my students, what do you say we wrap things up with a lightning round of those challenging questions that we promised our listeners?
Yeah, sounds fun. Let's do it.
Okay, so get those thinking caps on, everyone. It is time for our functional group challenge. Are you ready to test your knowledge?
Yeah, bring it on. I'm sure our listeners have been absorbing all this amazing information, so let's see what they've learned.
Okay, question number 1. Which functional group is responsible for the acidic nature of carboxylic acids?
Ooh, that's a classic. Think about the name, carboxylic acid. What group do we always see in those molecules?
That's right. The answer is the carboxyl group, TER, COOH. That combination of a carbonyl group and a hydroxyl group gives it that proton-donating power.
Okay, question number 2. Which functional group is the master bridge builder, forming those crucial disulfide bonds in proteins?
Hmm. Think about the amino acid that is famous for forming those bridges. Cysteine. What special group does cysteine have?
The answer is the sulfhydryl group, -H. Remember, those sulfur atoms love to link up, forming strong covalent bonds that stabilize that protein structure.
All right, question number 3. What makes those hydroxyl groups so hydrophilic, so attracted to water?
Okay, think about the electronegativity difference between oxygen and hydrogen. What does that create?
A polar bond. The answer is oxygen's high electronegativity. It pulls those electrons closer, giving oxygen a partial negative charge and making it a hydrogen bonding hotspot.
Okay, question number 4. We talked about two types of carbonyl-containing functional groups. Can you name them?
Think about where that carbonyl group, the CO, is located. Is it in the middle or at the end?
Exactly. The answer is ketones and aldehydes. Ketones have the carbonyl nestled within the carbon chain, while aldehydes have it proudly displayed at the end.
All right, question number 5. This one is all about energy. What makes the phosphate group so essential for energy storage?
Think about the molecule that powers those cellular processes, ATP. What is special about those phosphate groups?
Those high-energy bonds. The answer is that the phosphate group is a key component of ATP. Those bonds between the phosphate groups store energy that can be released to fuel all sorts of cellular work.
Question number 6. Which functional group is the proton-loving base, always ready to accept a hydrogen ion?
Think about the other half of the amino acid duo. We've got the acidic carboxyl group, but what balances it out?
It's the amino group, NH2. That nitrogen with its lone pair of electrons is a proton magnet.
Question number 7. This one is a bit trickier. Can you give an example of a molecule that contains both a hydroxyl group, A and D, a carbonyl group?
Think about a molecule that's both sweet and structurally important. It's a building block of larger carbohydrates and crucial for energy.
The answer is glucose. It's got multiple hydroxyl groups, making it soluble in water, and an aldehyde group, giving it some reactive potential.
Okay, question number 8. What type of reaction is involved in forming a peptide bond between two amino acids?
Think about what happens when those amino and carboxyl groups come together. What molecule is released as a byproduct?
It's a condensation reaction. A water molecule is removed as the carboxyl group of one amino acid reacts with the amino group of another, forging that peptide bond.
All right, question number 9. Which functional group makes a molecule more likely to dissolve in water, creating those essential aqueous solutions in our cells?
Think about the molecule that IS water H2O. What group does it have? And what does that tell us about polarity?
The answer is the hydroxyl group, OH. Its polarity allows it to form hydrogen bonds with water molecules, making those molecules soluble.
And finally, question number 10. Give an example of how methylation, the addition of a methyl group, can affect a biomolecule.
Think about the molecule that carries our genetic blueprint DNA. What can happen when a methyl group is added to DNA?
The answer is that methylation of DNA can silence gene expression. Adding a methyl group, CH3, to DNA can change its structure and prevent certain genes from being transcribed. It's a powerful mechanism for regulating gene activity.
Wow, 10 questions down. How did our listeners do?
I hope they aced it. But even if they missed a few, the important thing is that they're engaging with these concepts,
Oh.
thinking critically and deepening their understanding of functional groups.
That is right. Because at the end of the day, it is not just about memorizing structures or getting the right answer on a test. It is about appreciating the beauty and the power of these tiny molecular building blocks that orchestrate the symphony of life.
Beautifully said, and it is our privilege as educators to guide our students on this journey of discovery and inspire them with the wonders of biochemistry.
So to all our fellow biochem enthusiasts out there, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep sharing your passion for this amazing field. And be sure to join us for our next deep dive into the biochemical world. Until then, happy teaching.
Happy teaching!